I apologize for any technical difficulties. We're having a little bit of trouble with the video, but hopefully our normal folks on the audio side are able to hear everything okay.
So for this particular episode, I think that it's a good idea we don't usually go with a theme, but I think there is a little bit of a theme here that we need to really kind of explore because there's a number of incidents that kind of have happened in the last few weeks that sort of surround that whole notion. So I'll start out with one that will kind of set the stage a little bit. So this was an incident that occurred in the school district in Parkland, Florida, where they had the horrific shooting in February of 2018. Well, this past week, there was a student who attends school in Parkland who had threatened to bring a gun to school and shoot another student. And he made that threat playing Fortnite. And what kind of struck me about it, I mean, is clearly there's been a tremendous increase in threats and that sort of thing. But what struck me about it was one of the students that he made this threat to responded by recording the threat and uploading it to YouTube, and then telling the potential victim. And so that really speaks.
They were playing with people that they knew, like
I guess.
From school?
I guess, okay. Yeah. But I guess what strikes me about it is that how much progress have we made in terms of the see something, say something, that your response to that is to upload it to YouTube and to notify the potential victim, but not notify parents or law enforcement or the school. So that really sort of speaks to that whole thing of what kind of work we have to do with students. Mm-hmm. And it sets the stage for the little bit of a discussion that I want to have about kind of the costs to students for some of the school safety initiatives and some of the things that we're doing. So that takes us then to a situation that occurred a week or two before in New York City, where there were high school students who were protesting the use of surveillance equipment in public schools. And they went to the governor's office and were chanting, "Counselors, not cops," and the signs were "Support, not surveillance," and "Counselors, not cameras." And I thought that was a really interesting demonstration of something we haven't really seen before, mm-hmm. that sort of signifies potentially maybe turning a corner, or at least beginning to have realistic conversations about what is the value, which I would say there isn't, of surveilling students and of mm-hmm. treating them like inmates and mm-hmm. so on. So that was kind of an interesting thing that really has been coming out. What happened is there was about $30 million in state grants that's being used to purchase surveillance technology like facial recognition software, video monitoring, and stuff like that. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the concern with some of that is that it's not that we shouldn't have cameras, right? It's not that we shouldn't have cameras at all. But there is only so many dollars to go around. And with any of this stuff, there's only so many hours in the day. And so it's really an issue of priorities. And you hit the nail on the head talking about grant funding. There is grant funding for security type interventions, for surveillance type interventions, and there sometimes just is not the same type of funding for mental health supports, although that's improving a little bit, but there's not the same type of funding for being able to improve the professional practice of educators. Yeah. I mean, I am unaware of, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong and pull this to my attention, I am unaware of a single dollar of grant funding that was earmarked for professional development for educators.
For training and professional capacity.
Yeah, I think there's some that's kind of an afterthought, and there's some in mental health training for educators, which is important, but there is not for professional development for educators, for professional development for pre-service teachers or pre-service administrators. It's just so far off of the radar. And I think it's very telling that you have students who are raising these issues.
And who are seeing it mm-hmm. as being an invasion of privacy and, mm-hmm. and surveillance, because it is to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. Now, I think we have to acknowledge that there may be, I guess you could make the argument that there are instances where surveillance cameras and security cameras are beneficial and do increase safety. Mm-hmm. And they discussed, a bill in West Virginia that required schools to monitor special ed classrooms with video cameras because of some of the abuses that potentially we have seen before. that may have occurred in some of those settings. So, we have to acknowledge that I guess if we want to watch the event afterwards and see what sort of terrible things happened, there is some potential value for that. But I think we have to weigh very carefully that our students are seeing that. And I guess that's kind of the theme of in this particular episode is what are the perceptions of our students and how are our students seeing that? So let me take you.
Because if students have that complaint, it either means that we are not doing anything other than surveillance, or we are doing other things. We might be doing great professional development for educators, but no one knows about it. Yeah. So either it's a messaging problem, which is a problem, or it's a lack of doing a comprehensive approach to this work, which is a problem.
Yeah, so that takes us to sort of the other end. We talked about high school students. This is an incident that occurred in Arkansas last week, where there was a 6-year-old girl. 6-year-old child, actually, doesn't say the sex of the child. 6-year-old child used a disconnected cell phone and called 911 and reported a school shooting, and specifically at the elementary school. And so police were dispatched to the elementary school.
Used a disconnected phone
that still had the capability to call 911, but couldn't make any other calls. So the caller, this is a 6-year-old, said 5 people had been shot. And stayed on the phone talking to them as they frantically responded to this elementary school anticipating a school shooting. So there's a number of things to unpack there, but how is that the thing that we think as a 6-year-old? I mean, that says a lot about the immersion and the exposure. That's what a 6-year-old is thinking. If you're going to call 911, this is what you're going to be saying.
Yeah.
So that I think, and I don't know that we need to go into great detail of that, but I think we need to reflect a little bit about, what potentially that's saying. And then do you want to talk about this one? I don't know if you're familiar with it, about the students at Columbine.
Yeah, I just saw it a little bit on Twitter. It started with students at Columbine?
Yeah.
So they have these stickers that they are putting on their student IDs, and I think some of them on their cell phone cases.
And here's and right there's the verbiage of it.
Yeah, so it says, the sticker, what it says is, in the event that I die from gun violence, please publicize the photo of my death. And then they sign it.
Yeah, and so it asks for photos of their body to be publicized. And when I read this, it sort of, I have to say, I wasn't like, yeah, great. I mean, it was very disconcerting and shocking to think of that happening. And that's sort of the point. The video says, the video on the campaign says, we're numb, stuck in a loop, seeing the same images and over. So how do we end the cycle? Sometimes it takes seeing the worst of humanity to bring out the best. And then they talk about some of these really these photos that sort of turn the page in many cases, not related to school violence, but a lot of other things. And it talks about the idea that you can't look away because it changes that image. And I really was struck by that. And then the student says in the video, if name, stats, and studies aren't going to make a difference, then maybe the graphic images of our death will. And the hashtag is my last shot. And so I have mixed feelings about that. But I guess regardless of how I feel or we feel about it, it does raise the question of how our students, how our youth feel that this is as much on par as I'm an organ donor in the event of a car accident. So they feel that the probability of them dying from gun violence is as high as a traffic accident or something else as well.
Well, I think, not getting into the politics of it or any of that, I think it is indicative of there's a cost to our kids that all of this, not that there's a cost to our kids that school shootings happen, because obviously there is. There is a cost to our kids that school shootings and active shooter response takes up so much space in our heads. I mean, that's the sort of the old line about terrorism, right? Like, if we fundamentally change the way that we live our lives in this country, then I guess that's like then the terrorists have won, right? there is a cost to our kids that this takes up so much space in our mind. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, honor the people that we've lost to school shootings. I'm not saying that we should ignore this, but we have to be able to put it in its proper place. We didn't shut down air travel after 9/11.
Yeah.
We changed it, and people still travel, and you could say it's a pain, you could say they are overdoing it, you could say whatever, but I mean, I guess what I'm saying is people are able to fly without trauma, without additional trauma because of TSA, and without additional anxiety, at least not to the extent that we are inflicting on our children.
Yeah.
I mean,
and you have to think about it. People made a choice. People make a choice to fly. We have compulsory attendance.
Yeah,
this is a captive audience that is being exposed and saying, this is what we do. And you have to be here, and you have to, you don't have to, but essentially, you have to be here. And this is what you are subjected to, whatever it is that we, as in an administrator or a police chief or whoever, decides this is what we're going to subject you to, and you have to take it by nature of being enrolled in our school. That raises a lot of concerns and some discussions that I think need to be had of the role of advocacy, but also the role of the responsibility that is shared by parents and stakeholders and all the folks associated with schools of what are we doing? Or are we just saying, hey, somebody come do something to us and have it be in the name of safety, and we'll just all take it?
And we always are very careful about staying out of the politics about this. And this I think is a very specific, they're igniting and they're engaging in a very specific discussion about gun control. But the reality of this is, we have this discussion all the time, is if every gun in America magically disappeared tomorrow, we still have a school safety problem that's huge. And we still have school safety concerns, and that's fine of a point on the gun part of it, because this is a school safety problem. Sure. So if they want that their photos, if they die from gun violence, they want their photos. How about if someone drives a truck full of explosives into my high school and that's the way I die? I want that to be publicized. Yeah, and so I don't mean to be nitpicky at the advocacy of teens, but as adults,
but I'm not sure that. But I'm not sure that that your stance on guns necessarily changes your reaction to the idea of putting the photo of someone that died from I would assume that you could die from gun violence, or a person could say, I want people to be aware that gun violence happens regardless of what your stance is on guns.
Well, right, but
so it's not necessarily, unfortunately, probably will devolve into that.
But this campaign is about gun violence. It says right on it, it's about gun violence. Right. It's about the political issue of guns. It's not about the issue of safety in school.
True.
I guess that's what I was trying to say, is that I don't want to...
But how it is to a certain extent shocking that this is, or at least I think requires some reflection, that this is like what we're going, this seems that we're doing this, similar to a movement of, like I said, anti-drunk driving, or, I'm an organ donor, or whatever those things are. I felt that was sort of shocking. And what does that say about what our kids have been exposed to and what our kids are feeling?
Well, and I think that maybe the difference between your level of shock and my level of shock is indicative of a generational difference. I was in junior high when Columbine happened. So a post-Columbine world has been my whole adult life. And most of the time in my life that I can remember, and then think of younger people who are in school now, their entire lives have been post-Columbine. Yeah. So our level of shock and dismay and comfort and discomfort and concern, I think has to be situated in our experience in that way.
Yeah. Well, and so that sort of takes us to our last story, and that's a story that I felt was pretty well done by BBC News that was looking at, have we gone too far with trying to have realistic drills? And
this is more the fallout from what happened in Indiana that we already talked about.
Right, but this is looking at it from, I think, the student perspective. And they raise a lot of really valid points that I think we have to reflect on. So if you have the vast majority of states, significant number of states require some sort of lockdown drill. And typically it is going to default to an active shooter lockdown, which is not necessarily what we would advocate for. We would advocate for a more all-hazard sort of approach to lockdown drills. But clearly they're going to default to that. And then it talks about how the intensity of the drills has really escalated, the realism of the drills have really escalated, and even talking about they were, is the example of using the students as victims. So we're doing this drill and we're having the kids smeared with blood and they're pretending that they're shot, and it raises the question, which I think is a valid criticism, of to what end? So what exactly did we practice? And for whose benefit? Well, and I always have a concern with teachers and students being used as props.
For law enforcement training.
Yeah, being used as props or mannequins for training. Not that training shouldn't happen for law enforcement emergency responders, because clearly it should. But to take a general school population that is supposed to be there for the purpose of learning and to say, hey, because you're here, we need you to be victims.
Yeah.
If you want to do that on a Saturday with permission and blah, 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 maybe I feel a little bit differently about that. But to just say, well, okay, but I have less of a problem with that than to say you're a captive audience and you just happen to be here, so we want you to all act like there's. I mean, that's a problem.
I think you raised a good point of saying to what end. I don't know what the intended outcome is necessarily, but you know that the unintended outcome is that we are adding to this. What we are marinating. I mean, we are marinating kids from K-12 in this palpable fear. And it is not about teaching skills, and it's not about having discussions about what we would do. I mean, it is just fear. And I don't know how we can really move past that until we shift the way that we approach this work. I mean, if you think of like the ready.gov stuff where it talks about having a plan, like all of their PSAs of like, that you have a family emergency plan. Those PSAs aren't, holy cow, there could be a tornado in your neighborhood. Did you think about that? That it's hanging over you
or
all the
showing
time.
You. I mean, here's what looks like, here's the house blowing apart, and here's, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, you teach kindergartners stop, drop, and roll. You don't teach kindergartners you could die.
Or show them the picture of the burned kids.
Right.
And show them what it looks like when
and it's
someone's
not on the
burning
media,
alive.
and you
don't do that.
And you don't see it in the media every day. Stories of discussions of people who are burning to death in their beds.
Yeah.
I mean...
And then they go on. The article goes on to discuss another thing that I think you always comment about, and that's the idea of deception drills, where the only way to really prove that you don't know what you're doing, or to really make sure that you're scared enough about it, is to not make you aware that this is really a drill. And so I'm going to burst in and we're going to see what happens.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the worst of the offenders. And that, to me, you can maybe talk me into maybe, but I don't understand in any way why we want to see if we can absolutely traumatize someone and call it training.
I think part of this discussion, the way that it's going to change, is we have to acknowledge the fact that the way that we train law enforcement officials and military personnel is by its nature fundamentally different than the way that we ought to train civilians
and kids
and children. And it is not we can take our normal modalities of training law enforcement officials and place it on a school because this is an event that involves violence. Therefore, we should take a law enforcement training approach. You can't. It is not effective. It is damaging. It is there are costs that we can't even fully grasp yet of what we're doing to our kids in this country.
You've really taken this thing that kids maybe felt was sort of a nebulous fear and you've made it really graphically real. So you know how you were a little bit anxious about this thing, but you couldn't really imagine what it was, but you sort of had this vague unease. Now we have crystallized that image for you by reenacting it and showing you, so that, and by the deception part of it, making you actually live that trauma. All in the name of
It's like
I don't know,
I mean,
training,
it's like
I
if you
guess.
had a kid that was concerned about getting beat up at school by bullies, and the way that we're going to prepare you for potential bullies is I'm going to beat you up.
Yeah.
And then go, it's just a drill, I'm not a bully,
Or
I'm just beating you up.
Self-defense training. Self-defense training begins by me beating the living daylights out of you, so you can now understand what it feels like to be beaten up.
Actually, the simile for this would be is if you hired me to do self-defense training for you, and I just surprised you one day in your home and beat the shit out of you.
Yeah.
And didn't tell you that I was your practice person, and didn't tell you I was teaching you anything.
Now I'm taking it more seriously, even though I already hired you to teach me self-defense, so I clearly was taking it seriously. And now I'm somehow more prepared because I have experienced the trauma of being victimized.
And I understand that we do, and I am not an expert in this, but I understand the underlying rationale of why we have very specific experiential training for law enforcement officials and for military personnel.
And maybe to some extent for teachers, but not for kids.
But the difference between teachers and law enforcement officials are going to face high stress, potentially violent situations. They are going to. As their job as law enforcement officials, they're going to face that. They just are. That is the nature of their jobs. Teachers, statistically speaking, probably won't face incredibly violent life or death situations.
But at least you can make the argument that needs to be at least on their radar to a certain extent.
It is.
But to say, but I'm just saying, at least we can sort of make a little bit of an argument. But I can't find any argument that says we need to see that this 12-year-old is completely scared to death. Yeah. I don't see that. Yeah. And then I think the final point in this article that I thought was very interesting that I think is another thing worth reflecting on. It talked about how in these drills and trainings, we're essentially saying to kids, you now, under the guise of empowerment, which I understand, but we're saying to kids, you need to prevent this. So you need to stop the bleed. You need to save the lives of these other people. You need to rapidly evacuate and save the lives of all of your classmates. And we have to at least be a little bit sensitive to the fact that it's not realistic. And so what sort of trauma have we given survivors of these events that I was supposed to be able to do these things because I had a 10-minute video or my teacher talked to me one time about this. And so now I'm supposedly supposed to know how to do all this stuff that the adults around me even don't necessarily know how to do. And I think that's another, and again, to what end? What are the chances that a kid is going to be the only person there who knows how to stop the bleeding? And then you can make the argument, well, then why do we even teach kids how to dial 911? Because that's traumatic. So, I mean, it's this sort of incremental steps from these life skills that make sense to these really specific situational traumas that I feel like we've just gone too far, perhaps, down that continuum. Yeah. And I think that's something that we need to reflect on for teachers, which we sort of talked about last time. But we also need to think about it in terms of kids, too.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to leave it there because I feel like we could talk about this for another 30 minutes or so.
Well, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So it's something that we all need to reflect on.
Yeah. Please do rate and review and subscribe if you're listening on the podcast side. If you're joining us here on YouTube, we ask that you would, subscribe and check out some of our other videos, other information that we have. If you have any questions for us, you can always reach out to us, info@eschoolsafety.org. And if you have questions or you're looking for resources or other things that we have, you can always head to the website, which is www.eschoolsafety.org. So until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So this is on a lag, so I have to keep it going for a little while.
there.